So friends, it is my experience that people, both religious and unreligious folk alike, but it is my experience that folk love the Jesus that we meet in today's story from the Gospel of John. Because this morning we don't meet Jesus the healer. We don't meet Jesus the miracle worker. We don't meet Jesus the gentle teacher of spiritual truth. But this morning we meet Jesus the rabble rouser. We meet Jesus the radical reformer. Jesus the flipper over of tables. Is it true? Do you like this version of Jesus? Yeah, there's a lot to love in this story. It's a very dramatic story. It's practically made for TV. It really gets the blood pumping. And because there's so much good stuff happening in this passage this morning, here's how I want to break it down for us. First, I want to talk about what specifically it was that Jesus was protesting. Then I want to talk about how it is that he did his protest. And then finally, I want to talk about how people responded to his protest. So what he was protesting, how he protested, and then how people responded. So first off, what was it exactly that Jesus was protesting? What caused him so much ire? What caused him to get his back up so much in this morning's story? Well, our story opens with Jesus and his entourage entering into Jerusalem in order to celebrate Passover. Passover, of course, is a Jewish religious holiday in which Jews remember their deliverance from slavery in Egypt. It's celebrated for 7 full days. Now, back then, all adult males within 15 miles of the temple were required by law to come and observe Passover at the temple. And then in addition to all of them, Jews from across the Roman Empire would make this pilgrimage to the temple in Jerusalem in order to make those animal sacrifices mandated by the Old Testament during Passover. So imagine this. You are traveling from Italy to Jerusalem via boat, via foot, and if you happen to be rather wealthy, also via camel or donkey. Now, you are not going to make that trip carrying a sacrificial sheep under your arm. Right? That is a ridiculous, if not impossible thing. Likewise, when you show up to Jerusalem, you are going to show up with pockets full of foreign currency that you are going to need to exchange if you want to buy anything. In particular, if you want to buy an animal to sacrifice, as was mandated by the Old Testament scriptures. And so, in service of the temple's sacrificial system, and in order to accommodate all the faithful coming from abroad, animal sellers and money changers were set up right there in the temple all throughout the week of Passover. And while this was a really convenient system, it did have some drawbacks. Namely, when Jesus and his friends entered into the temple, they were met not with the solemn dignity and the murmur of prayer, but rather they were met with the bellowing of cattle and the bleating of sheep. They were met not with the displays of personal devotion and contrition. No, they were instead met with the noise and commotion of commerce and action. The temple felt less like a house of worship, and it felt more like Walmart on Black Friday. So while there was good reason for having these money changers and these animal sellers in the temple, it was getting in the way. So much so that it felt like this place of prayer and worship had been turned into a marketplace. And that is Jesus' critique. That is his reason for protest. His Father's house, he says, has been turned into a literal marketplace. So that is what Jesus is protesting. Now on to how he protested. So upon observing the temple being treated like a TJ Maxx, what does Jesus do? He goes and he finds himself some rope, presumably the rope that was being used to keep all these various animals in place. And he fashions himself a whip or flail type object. So if right now in your mind's eye you are picturing Jesus brandishing an Indiana Jones style bullwhip, that is not quite right. Because what we were talking about here is what we in the Dungeons and Dragons community would refer to as an improvised weapon. We're talking minimal damage stats here. There is nobody who is going to get seriously injured by this makeshift whip that Jesus has hobbled together on the fly. P.S. If you understood that D&D reference, you're exactly the kind of nerd that we need to show up to our board game night next month. February 25th, 6th. Dave's going to be there. 6 to 9 p.m. Mark your calendars. In any case, Jesus MacGyvers together this whip, and he uses it to start chasing out of the temple every last cow and sheep, every last money changer and animal seller. He then pulls one of these numbers, and he knocks all the money off the money changers' tables, and then he flips over the tables themselves. Like I said before, this is a dramatic scene, practically made for TV. But to be perfectly clear here, to be absolutely clear on this point, weapons were illegal in the temple, and right next door to the temple there was actually a Roman fortress full of Roman soldiers. Which is to say that if this whip thing that Jesus was carrying around and chasing people around with, if this was truly dangerous, and if he was physically injuring people, he would have been arrested by the authorities on the spot. So he was causing a ruckus, yes he was, but he was not hurting anybody. I want to be clear about that point. So in response to his Father's house being treated like a marketplace, Jesus protests by interrupting that marketplace in a nonviolent but fairly uproarious fashion. That is how Jesus went about his protest. Last but not least, we need to talk about how people responded to this protest of Jesus's. Because maybe you noticed that after the dust settled, after all the hay had fluttered to the ground, all the cattle stopped mooing, the sheep stopped baaing, they all simmered down, the temple religious leaders did not actually try to dispute the point that Jesus was making. They did not try to argue that having money changers and animal sellers in the temple was a good and proper thing that didn't interfere with worship. They don't defend the practice at all. Rather, what they do is they call into question Jesus' authority to do what he did. And in debate, this is what you would call an ad hominem attack. You can't refute the argument itself, so what do? You attack the character of the person making the argument. I think this is what we all do when we're arguing with someone, and we know we're in the wrong, but we're not willing to admit it. Right? We don't argue the point, we attack the person. Classic. The temple leaders say to Jesus, if God gave you the authority to do this, then show us a miraculous sign to prove it. Jesus responds by saying, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Now, in the moment, that was a somewhat enigmatic statement for Jesus to make. It's a statement that confuses both the disciples and the temple leaders. But looking back, in retrospect, you and I and the disciples all realize that here Jesus was clearly referencing his death and his resurrection. The ultimate sign of his power and authority. So how did folk respond to Jesus' protest? They respond not by defending the tables that Jesus has overturned, but by questioning his authority to do so. So, after having heard all that, who here is still digging this Jesus? Right? Are you still vibing with this Jesus? Whip making, table turning Jesus? We like him, right? Good. 2 points to make in closing. Number one, hearing this story on a Sunday morning in a Christian church, we tend to read into the story a very harsh us versus them dynamic. Right? We see this as a Christian Jesus versus the Jews in the temple. And so it's important to keep in mind now and always that Jesus was Jewish himself. And while he was indeed a radical reformer, and while they were having a very strong disagreement, the people in the temple are his people. They are Jesus' people. Which is to say, Jesus doesn't flip the tables of outsiders of other people. He flips the tables of his own people. So if you're sitting here right now smiling smugly, thinking, Lord, I can think of 5, 6 people who need a table flipping in their life, I hate to break it to you, but it's far more likely that you yourself are, this is a bad way of putting it, are on Jesus' hit list. It is your table that Jesus is going to flip over, not the person, the 5 or 6 people that you are thinking about right now. Point number 1, Jesus flipped the table of his own people, not the tables of others. And then number 2, in closing, the second thing I want to point out to y'all is that the thing that Jesus is protesting today is not some grand injustice. Right? No one is being exploited in this system. In fact, money changers were esteemed members of their local communities. They were generally thought to be above reproach. And there's even some historical evidence to suggest that during the week of Passover, money changers actually didn't make any profit. They offered their services for free. So what is happening here is not some grand injustice. Rather, what Jesus is taking issue with, what he's taking issue with today, is a system, a structure, a way of doing things that, in all honesty, has brought his people from a long ways. They were once slaves in Egypt, and this way of practicing their faith has brought them out of that oppression, has brought them to the promised land where they currently reside. Their way of practicing their faith has built this big, beautiful temple that they're standing in, and in which they can praise their God. It has even brought them this micro economy inside the temple that's going just to keep the whole thing running. Yes, this way of doing things has brought God's people a long ways. But in today's story, what Jesus is saying is that, yeah, it has brought you a long ways, but now it is getting in the way. It was designed to help you connect to God, but now the system that you set up is actually interfering with your capacity to connect with God. And you see that's not condemnation per se. That's not Jesus judging this system as sinful or evil or bad. That's just how growth and development works. Something moves you to a new place. It helps you grow. But then in order to keep growing, you need to leave that thing behind. This is a weird example, but think about puberty. In order to become an adult, that is something that you need to pass through, right? And in that way, it is a good thing. But there ain't nobody who want to be stuck there forever. Voice cracking, mood swinging, acne breaking out. I'm glad it got us where we are, but I'm even gladder that it's in the rear view mirror. And so it goes with God. In order to keep our connection growing, there are things that we all need to let go of. There are things that we all need to put in our rear view mirror. And the key is that when the time comes and Jesus comes into your life flipping over tables, something you hold dear, something that has brought you a long way, be it a particular belief or way of thinking about yourself and others, be it a relationship, a friendship, and a romantic entanglement, whatever it may be, the key is that when Jesus comes into your life flipping over your tables, is that unlike the temple leaders, you accept and you trust his authority to do so. You trust the authority of his person. You trust the authority of his teachings. And more than anything, friends, you trust the authority of his love. And so, friends, it is my prayer for all of us today that your tables may be flipped, that you never stop growing in connection to God. In Jesus' name, amen.